This documentary is presented to you in the form of an audiobook. Capital is dead labour which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labour, and lives the more labour it sucks. With this single, chilling metaphor from Das Kapital, Karl Marx transforms economic theory into Gothic horror. The German original Das Kapital ist verstorbene Arbeit, die sich nur vampyrmäßig belebt durch Einsaugung lebendiger Arbeit, employs a linguistic precision that English translation can't fully capture. Capital doesn't merely extract value, it quite literally drinks the life essence of workers. This vampire image isn't mere rhetorical flourish. It represents Marx's most fundamental insight, that capitalism operates as a supernatural inversion of natural order, the dead commanding the living, the created dominating its creators. When Marx deploys this symbol, he's doing something far more sophisticated than crafting political propaganda. He's constructing an entire symbolic architecture to make visible what economic language alone cannot express. What if Marx's revolutionary power lies not just in his economic analysis, but in his mastery of symbolic language? Throughout his work lies a complex web of literary devices, biblical inversions, alchemical transformations, theatrical metaphors that form an interconnected symbolic system. Understanding this symbolic dimension may be the key to grasping what makes Marx's critique of capitalism so enduringly powerful, so resistant to dismissal, and so fundamentally unsettling. Far from being merely a political economist, Karl Marx was a deliberate literary stylist whose command of symbolic language wasn't incidental, but essential to his revolutionary framework. His rhetoric wasn't decoration, it was methodology. As Marshall Berman noted in All That Is Solid Melts into Air, Marx's literary techniques don't simply illustrate his ideas, they embody them. Edmund Wilson, in To the Finland Station, recognised Marx as a writer whose symbolic imagination rivaled the great literary figures of his century. Marx's symbolic universe operates through several distinct yet interconnected categories: religious inversions that reframe familiar biblical motifs, economic personification that brings abstract forces to life, mechanical metaphors that capture industrial reality, theatrical frameworks that reveal social performance, and alchemical transformations that show capital's mystical conversions. Our analysis will ground itself firmly in textual evidence from Marx's original works, German where significant, while drawing on recognised scholarly interpretations to illuminate patterns other readers have identified. We'll map Marx's symbolic landscape not through speculation, but through careful documentation of his actual literary practice. Marx's most profound religious symbolism appears in his theory of commodity fetishism, where he deliberately inverts sacred imagery to reveal capitalism's hidden structures. In Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1, he writes, "A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious trivial thing, but its analysis shows that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. The term fetishism itself is borrowed from religious anthropology, a deliberate choice." Marx continues, "The form of wood, for instance, is altered if a table is made out of it. Nevertheless, the table continues to be wood, an ordinary sensuous thing, but as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness." Here Marx portrays commodities as transubstantiated objects, ordinary materials that through market relations acquire supernatural qualities. This religious inversion reaches its culmination when Marx declares, "To find an analogy, we must take flight into the misty realm of religion. There the products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own, which enter into relations both with each other and the human race. The commodity, like a deity, becomes an independent entity that rules over its creators rather than being ruled by them." Similarly, the Communist Manifesto opens with the now famous line, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." This isn't merely dramatic rhetoric, it's a deliberate biblical inversion. Marx transforms communism from a material political movement into a ghostly apparition, invoking the Holy Ghost while simultaneously subverting Christian eschatology. Revolution becomes apocalypse, communism becomes revelation. Roland Barthes observed in Mythologies that Marx's genius lay in his ability to systematically reverse religious mythology. Where religion mystifies the mundane by making it sacred, Marx demystifies the supposedly sacred, capitalism, by showing its mundane material origins. Barthes noted that Marx doesn't simply reject religious symbolism, he repurposes it, creating what Barthes called a second-order mythology, where religious forms are preserved but their content is inverted. Marx's literary toolkit extends beyond religious imagery to include classical literature, which he deploys with strategic precision. When describing the horrors of industrial factories and capital, Marx deliberately evokes Dante's Inferno, writing, "Dante would have found the worst horrors of his Inferno surpassed in this industry." This isn't casual hyperbole, but a calculated literary choice. By invoking Dante's circles of hell, Marx transforms factory floors into otherworldly realms of torment. In Chapter 15 of Capital, he describes English factory reports as records of martyrdom, drawing a direct line between classical depictions of suffering and modern industrial exploitation. The factory becomes not merely an unpleasant workplace, but a realm of eternal punishment where workers are condemned to repetitive torment. Shakespeare appears throughout Marx's writings, functioning as both authority and ironic commentator. In Capital, Marx quotes Shylock from The Merchant of Venice to illustrate capital's insatiable demand. "My deeds, upon my head. I crave the law, the penalty and forfeit of my bond." This allusion draws a deliberate parallel between the moneylender's demand for a pound of flesh and capital's extraction of labour value. In a particularly revealing moment, Marx quotes from A Midsummer Night's Dream, "What you see when you don't have any money is not worth a plugged nickel." By repurposing Shakespeare's line about lovers seeing with their hearts, Marx creates a materialist inversion that serves his theoretical framework while demonstrating his literary sophistication. Perhaps most significant was Heinrich Heine's influence on Marx's style. As Marx's personal friend and fellow German exile, Heine's caustic wit and metaphorical density shaped Marx's own rhetorical approach. From Heine, Marx adopted the technique of using seemingly casual literary references to deliver devastating critique. The poet's influence appears in Marx's sardonic tone, his use of juxtaposition, and his ability to condense complex arguments into memorable phrases. Marx's biographer, Francis Wien, notes that Marx absorbed Heine's technique of weaponizing irony, evident when Marx describes money as having the divine power of being the universal equivalent, or when he characterizes the factory owner's perspective with biting sarcasm. "Time is everything. Man is nothing. He is, at the most, time's carcass." Greek mythology provides Marx with a rich symbolic vocabulary that appears throughout his work, beginning with his doctoral dissertation. In his 1841 thesis on Epicurean philosophy, Marx explicitly identifies with Prometheus, dedicating his work to the Titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Marx writes in the foreword, "Prometheus is the most eminent saint and martyr in the philosophical calendar." This is no casual reference. Marx saw himself and philosophy itself as Promethean, bringing enlightenment to humanity against the wishes of established powers. The punishment of Prometheus, chained to a rock, his liver eternally devoured, becomes a metaphor for the revolutionary thinkers suffering at the hands of the status quo. This Promethean symbolism carries into Marx's later economic writings. In the Grundrisse, he describes how industrial machinery, like Prometheus's gift of fire, contains revolutionary potential but has been turned into an instrument of torment under capitalism. A technology that could liberate humanity instead becomes its prison. The myth of Sisyphus emerges in Marx's descriptions of proletarian labour. In Capital Volume 1, Marx portrays factory work as an endless repetition of the same motions, a torment of Sisyphus, where workers, like the mythological figure, are condemned to push the same boulder up the hill day after day without purpose or end. This imagery reveals Marx's understanding of alienated labour as not merely unpleasant but existentially absurd. Cyril Smith, in his analysis, Marx and the Origins of Dialectical Materialism, argues that Marx's use of Greek mythology isn't merely decorative but structural to his thinking. Smith writes, Marx's dialectical method itself draws on the Greek understanding of cosmic conflict and transformation. According to Smith, Marx's entire conceptual framework, with its clashing opposites and transformative synthesis, mirrors the Greek mythological worldview, where gods and titans struggle for primacy. Smith further observes that Marx's portrayal of capitalists as personifications of economic categories echoes the Greek practice of personifying natural forces as gods. Just as Zeus personified lightning and Poseidon the sea, the capitalist in Marx's writing personifies capital, with one crucial inversion. Marx shows these economic gods to be human creations rather than creators of humanity. Perhaps Marx's most distinctive literary technique is his creation of symbolic character types that personify economic relations. In Capital Volume 1, Chapter 4, Marx introduces the capitalist not as a fully realized individual, but as capital personified and endowed with consciousness and a will. This is a sophisticated literary device. Marx writes, "The capitalist functions only as personified capital as a person, just as the worker is no more than labour personified." Here, the capitalist becomes a character in Marx's economic drama, a living embodiment of an abstract force. Marx reinforces this characterization by consistently referring to money bags rather than using a proper name. This deliberate depersonalization serves a theoretical purpose, to show that the capitalist's actions are determined not by individual psychology, but by structural position within the economic system. The capitalist as character speaks in distinctive ways. In Chapter 7, Marx ventriloquizes, "I paid for a day's worth of labour power, and a day's worth of labour power belongs to me." This first-person narration isn't merely satirical, but reveals the logic of capital speaking through human vessels. Workers undergo similar symbolic transformation in Marx's narrative. The worker appears not as an individual with unique traits, but as the personification of labour time. Marx writes that the worker is nothing more than personified labour time, reduced to an embodiment of abstract human energy. This characterization reaches its most powerful expression when Marx describes workers as variable capital, human beings transformed into a mere component of the production process, differentiated from machines only by their capacity to create surplus value. These symbolic characterizations create a literary framework that mirrors Marx's theoretical analysis. Just as economic relations under capitalism reduce humans to abstractions, Marx's narrative technique reduces characters to personifications of economic categories. Marx scholar David McClellan notes that this characterization technique allows Marx to move between abstract economic theory and concrete human experience. The capitalist as character and worker as character become literary devices that make visible the invisible operations of the economic system. The brilliance of this technique is that Marx never needs to argue that capitalists are evil individuals. Instead, his characterization shows how ordinary people, placed within capitalism's structure, become functional embodiments of impersonal economic forces regardless of their individual morality. Through these symbolic character constructions, Marx's economic analysis becomes simultaneously a work of literature, one where characters act not from psychological motivations, but as expressions of the economic relationships they embody. Moving beyond character constructions, Marx develops a rich symbolic language to visualize capital itself. One of his most evocative metaphors appears in Chapter 8 of Capital, where he describes capital as dead labour, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labour, and lives the more labour it sucks. This metaphor of capital as congealed or dead labour is far more than a rhetorical flourish. It encapsulates Marx's fundamental insight that capital is not a thing, but a social relation. Wealth created by human labour that has been crystallized into objects and machinery. The metaphor performs theoretical work by making visible what capitalism obscures, that capital is not self-generating but derived entirely from human productive activity. When Marx writes that a machine contains congealed labour time, he transforms an ordinary object into a symbol of social relations. Marx further develops his symbolic representation of capital through the formula MCM prime, money commodity more money. This deceptively simple equation captures the entire logic of capitalist circulation and accumulation. The formula shows that under capitalism, money is transformed into commodities not for use, but to generate more money. The prime symbol M- represents surplus value, the mysterious increment that constitutes profit. Through this symbolic representation, Marx demonstrates that capitalism's driving force is not production for human needs, but endless accumulation. The circulation formula exposes what Marx calls capital's valorization process, its need to constantly expand or die. David Harvey, in a companion to Marx's Capital, notes that these symbolic representations allow Marx to trace the molecular processes of capital through time and space. Harvey argues that Marx's symbolic language maps invisible economic flows, making them tangible. Harvey particularly emphasizes how Marx's symbolism reveals that capital is motion rather than a fixed object. The formula MCM prime visualizes capital as a process, a constant metamorphosis from one form to another. According to Harvey, Marx's symbolic representations perform a radical demystification. By reducing capital's movements to symbolic formulas, Marx strips away the mystical qualities that political economists attribute to capital, revealing its mundane human origins. What makes Marx's symbolism so powerful, Harvey suggests, is its ability to show how abstract economic processes manifest in concrete material realities, how invisible flows of value create visible social conditions. Marx's most enduring symbolic representations appear in his depictions of class relationships. The Communist Manifesto's famous declaration that workers have nothing to lose but their chains distills complex economic analysis into a single powerful image that has resonated for generations. The chains metaphor performs multiple symbolic functions simultaneously. It characterizes wage labor as a form of bondage, connecting modern capitalism to historical slavery, while suggesting revolutionary possibility. Chains, unlike inherent conditions, can be broken. In German, Marx uses Ketten, which can mean both metal chains and more abstract forms of bondage. This deliberate ambiguity allows the metaphor to operate at both literal and figurative levels, representing both physical hardship and structural constraint. Equally powerful is Marx's characterization of the bourgeoisie as their own grave diggers. This metaphor appears in the Communist Manifesto's culminating argument. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. This gravedigger metaphor functions as prophetic symbolism, casting capitalism's downfall as predetermined by its internal contradictions. The image suggests that capitalism, through its own operation, creates the very conditions and social forces that will ultimately destroy it. The metaphor's elegance lies in its compression of Marx's complex economic theory of crisis into a single visual image that any reader can grasp. The bourgeoisie digging their own grave through their pursuit of profit. Throughout his works, Marx consistently employs military and warfare metaphors to characterize class relations. In Capital, he describes factories as industrial battlefields and refers to conflicts between workers and owners as skirmishes in a larger class war. These military metaphors serve to reframe seemingly peaceful economic transactions as violent confrontations. When Marx describes wage negotiations as battles, he transforms abstract market relations into concrete power struggles. In the 18th Brumaire, Marx writes that the bourgeoisie conquered power and established a martial law of profit, reinforcing his portrayal of class relations as fundamentally antagonistic rather than harmonious. Marx's warfare symbolism culminates in his call for workers to form an army in their struggle against capital, transforming economic organization into military mobilization. This military language wasn't metaphorical exaggeration, but a precise symbolic representation of how Marx understood class relations, as fundamentally based on power, coercion, and struggle rather than free exchange. Marx's symbolic imagination transforms everyday objects into carriers of deeper meaning. In Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1, he describes the commodity as a social hieroglyphic, an object that appears simple but contains encoded social information invisible to ordinary perception. Value, Marx writes, does not have its description branded on its forehead. Instead, commodities transform human relations into the fantastic form of a relation between things. This hieroglyphic metaphor suggests that commodities require deciphering, just as ancient Egyptian symbols needed translation. The hieroglyphic metaphor serves Marx's larger theoretical purpose, revealing how capitalism presents social relationships as natural properties of objects. A commodity's price appears as an inherent quality rather than the result of human labor and social organization. Marx develops a parallel symbolic representation of the factory as both prison and hell. In Capital's chapter on the working day, he describes factories as modern dungeons, where workers are confined and subjected to torture through exhaustion and dangerous conditions. This prison metaphor extends beyond mere comparison. Marx quotes factory inspectors who explicitly compare the factory system to penitentiaries, noting that in some ways, the prison regimen is much more humane than factory discipline. The emotional resonance of this symbolism grows when Marx invokes Dante's Inferno, transforming factories into circles of hell with capitalists as demons overseeing torment. Workers move through factory gates as souls entering damnation. Machinery itself becomes a powerful symbol in Marx's writing. He characterizes industrial equipment as dead labor dominating living labor, machines as vampiric entities containing the congealed labor of previous generations now turned against current workers. This symbolic representation reveals the historical irony Marx identified. Technology that could liberate humanity from toil instead becomes an instrument of intensified exploitation. The machine, a human creation, comes to rule its creators. When Marx writes that machinery confronts living labor as capital, as dead labor which dominates and pumps dry living labor power, he creates a symbolic inversion where objects control humans rather than humans controlling objects. Frederick Jameson, in Representing Capital, argues that Marx's object symbolism constitutes a revolutionary literary technique. Jameson writes that Marx's symbolic transformation of objects into social relationships performs the theoretical work that his analysis requires. According to Jameson, Marx's symbolic method allows readers to perceive the ghostly objectivity of value, how social relations become embedded in physical objects under capitalism. The object world becomes legible as a system of disguised human relationships. Jameson particularly emphasizes how Marx's symbolism undermines commodity fetishism by making visible what the market obscures. When Marx symbolically represents commodities as congealed labor time, he strips away their mystical appearance to reveal their human origins. Beyond object symbolism, Marx employs personification to animate economic forces. In the 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts, he characterizes money as the universal pimp between man's need and the object, a mackerel that brings together people who would otherwise have no connection. This characterization of money as pimp isn't merely colourful rhetoric. It reveals money's role in mediating human relationships in ways that distort genuine connection, transforming meaningful bonds into impersonal transactions. Marx writes that money is the visible divinity that transforms all human and natural qualities into their opposites. This personification reveals how an inanimate object comes to possess seemingly godlike powers over human affairs. Market forces throughout Marx's works acquire human attributes. In Capital, he describes the market as having moods, being sometimes anxious and other times confident. Price mechanisms react to events, while economic crises discipline workers and capitalists alike. This personification technique reveals Marx's insight that markets present themselves as natural forces when they are actually human creations. When the market demands sacrifice, Marx shows this as a mystification of human power relations rather than an inevitable natural law. In Chapter 3 of Capital, Marx writes that commodities cannot take themselves to market and they cannot exchange themselves. Yet capitalism presents them as if they possess independent agency, a symbolic inversion Marx highlights through ironic personification. Perhaps Marx's most significant personification is his treatment of history itself as an actor with purpose. This is not mere literary flourish, but central to his theoretical approach. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels write, "History does nothing, it possesses no immense wealth, it wages no battles. It is man, real, living man who does all that, who possesses and fights. History is not, as it were, a person apart, using man as a means to achieve its own aims. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing his aims." This passage reveals the dual nature of Marx's personification technique. He simultaneously employs personification, history does nothing, while critiquing the idealist personification of historical forces as independent from human activity. Marx scholar Terry Eagleton notes this creates a strategic contradiction in Marx's writing. He personifies economic forces to make visible their power, while simultaneously demystifying the apparent independence of these forces from human action. When Marx writes that capital comes dripping from head to foot, from every pore with blood and dirt, he employs personification to dramatic effect. This technique transforms abstract economic categories into visceral actors in a historical drama, making theoretical analysis emotionally resonant. The personification of economic forces allows Marx to create what literary critics call narrative tension. By giving agency to capital, commodities, and markets, he constructs an antagonistic relationship between these forces and living human beings, a literary technique that reinforces his political analysis. Beyond Marx's metaphors and personifications lies a deeper level of symbolic patterning in his rhetorical structures. Marx doesn't merely describe dialectical processes. His writing itself embodies dialectical movement, creating a form that mirrors his philosophical content. In Capital's opening chapter, Marx begins with the commodity's apparent simplicity before revealing its inner contradictions. His prose moves through successive contradictions: use value versus exchange value, concrete versus abstract labour, enacting the very dialectical method he advocates. This isn't arbitrary stylistic choice, but precise symbolic technique. Marx's sentences often contain their own internal contradictions, with clauses that negate or transform previous assertions, creating miniature dialectical movements within individual passages. The thesis-antithesis synthesis structure appears throughout Marx's work at multiple levels. Individual paragraphs often begin with an established economic doctrine, thesis, reveal its contradictions or limitations, antithesis, before advancing to a higher understanding, synthesis. In the Communist Manifesto, this structure operates at the macro level. The document begins with existing class relations, thesis, moves through their contradictions, antithesis, before projecting their revolutionary resolution, synthesis. The writing performs the very historical process it describes. Marx scholar Bertel Ollmann, in Dance of the Dialectic, argues that Marx's rhetorical structure creates a distinctive, dialectical sensibility in readers. Ollmann writes, Marx's prose doesn't simply explain dialectical thinking, it trains the mind to perceive dialectically. According to Ullmann, Marx's constant shifting between different levels of abstraction, from concrete examples to abstract principles and back, creates a philosophical depth lacking in conventional economic writing. Each shift in abstraction level represents a movement in dialectical understanding. Ullmann identifies Marx's use of internal relations as his key dialectical literary technique. When Marx writes that capital is not a thing, but a social relation, he's employing a rhetorical structure that collapses conventional categories, revealing connections hidden by ordinary language. This technique appears most powerfully in Marx's treatment of contradictions. Rather than viewing contradictions as errors to be resolved, Marx's prose embraces and develops them. When capital simultaneously treats labour as the source of all value and as a commodity with its own value, the contradiction becomes generative rather than problematic. Ullmann argues that Marx's rhetorical structures serve a pedagogical purpose, teaching readers to perceive reality as process rather than fixed state. By consistently emphasizing development, transformation, and internal connection, Marx's prose reshapes consciousness. What appears as stylistic peculiarity in Marx, his tendency to approach the same concept from multiple angles, his repetition with variation, his nesting of arguments within arguments, reflects his dialectical understanding that every phenomenon contains multiple relations seen differently from different perspectives. Marx's symbolic achievement, Ullmann suggests, lies in creating a prose style that doesn't merely describe reality differently, but enables readers to perceive it differently, a rhetorical structure that performs the revolutionary consciousness it seeks to create. Marx constructs overarching symbolic frameworks that organize his entire theoretical approach. The most influential is the base superstructure metaphor introduced in A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure. This architectural metaphor provides a visual model for understanding how economic relations determine social institutions. It creates a symbolic topography where economic foundations support cultural and political buildings above them. The spatial arrangement is crucial to the metaphor's power. By positioning economic relations as foundational, Marx creates a symbolic framework that challenges idealist philosophies, placing ideas as primary and material conditions as secondary. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels develop another powerful symbolic framework using the camera obscura. If in all ideology, men and their circumstances appear upside down as in a camera obscura, This phenomenon arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects on the retina does from their physical life process. This optical metaphor serves multiple symbolic functions. It characterizes ideology as an inverted image of reality, suggests that distortion occurs through a determinable physical process, and implies that correct understanding requires a systematic reorientation of perception. The camera obscura wasn't merely decorative but structurally essential to Marx's critique of idealism. It provided a concrete visual model for understanding how consciousness is determined by material conditions rather than the reverse. Architectural metaphors appear throughout Marx's work, creating consistent symbolic frameworks. He describes capitalism as having hidden foundations, speaks of the edifice of bourgeois society, and characterizes revolution as the collapse of old structures and the building of new ones. In Capital Volume 1, Marx writes about penetrating into the hidden abode of production, creating a spatial metaphor where surface appearances, the market, conceal deeper structural realities. The architectural framework becomes a symbolic journey from appearance to essence. Political institutions are consistently described as superstructural, positioned above and determined by economic relations. This spatial arrangement symbolically counters liberal political theory, which treats political institutions as foundational rather than derivative. Raymond Williams, in Marxism and Literature, offers crucial insights into these symbolic frameworks. Williams argues that Marx's base G-superstructure metaphor has been oversimplified by later interpreters, noting that Marx himself used it with greater nuance and flexibility. According to Williams, the architectural metaphor was intended to combat idealism, but risks creating a new form of determinism if taken too literally. He suggests that Marx employed this symbolic framework strategically rather than dogmatically. Williams points out that Marx's symbolic frameworks evolved throughout his career. The rigid spatial metaphors of his earlier works gave way to more dynamic processual models in Capital, where economic and cultural elements interact in complex dialectical relationships. What makes Marx's symbolic framework so powerful, Williams argues, is their ability to organize complex social phenomena into coherent patterns, while simultaneously revealing relationships that ordinary perception misses. They function as both analytical tools and revelatory devices. At the most granular level, Marx employs distinctive linguistic patterns that reinforce his theoretical framework. His most memorable line from the Communist Manifesto demonstrates his mastery of paradox. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life. This famous phrase, everything solid melts into air, encapsulates capitalism's contradictory nature through linguistic contradiction. The solid becoming airborne represents how capitalism simultaneously creates material structures while dissolving traditional social bonds. Marx's paradoxical constructions aren't stylistic ornaments, but precise symbolic representations of the contradictions he identifies within capitalism itself. When he writes of the anarchy of production alongside the despotism of the workplace, the linguistic tension mirrors the systemic tension. Transformation metaphors appear repeatedly throughout Marx's writings, creating persistent linguistic patterns. He consistently describes social processes as metamorphoses, economic development as alchemy, and revolutionary change as dialectical inversion. In Capital Volume 1, Marx characterizes the transformation of money into commodities and back into money as a metamorphosis, a biological metaphor that suggests natural development while highlighting the mysterious transformation of value forms. This repetition creates a linguistic pattern that reinforces Marx's view of capitalism as perpetual transformation rather than stable state. His prose vibrates with verbs of change, transforms, converts, inverts, negates, creating a linguistic field of constant movement. The original German texts reveal significant wordplay that enriches Marx's symbolic language. In German, Marx creates compound words that carry multiple connotations. Mehrwert, surplus value, connects to vermehren, to multiply, and Wert, value, creating resonances lost in translation. When Marx describes labour as both Arbeit, work, labour, and Arbeitskraft, labour power, the linguistic distinction reinforces his theoretical distinction between concrete labour that produces use values and abstract labour that produces exchange value. Marx's famous phrase Entfremdung, alienation, carries richer connotations in German, suggesting both making foreign and taking away, a dual meaning that precisely captures Marx's concept of workers becoming estranged from their own productive activity. Louis Althusser, in Reading Capital, offers penetrating analysis of Marx's linguistic patterns. Althusser argues that Marx employs a symptomatic reading technique that attends to silences, absences, and contradictions within text, creating a distinct linguistic methodology. According to Althusser, Marx's linguistic patterns represent a scientific revolution in discourse. The repetition of certain terms, surplus value, relations of production, and the systematic development of conceptual vocabulary constitutes not merely style but scientific innovation. Althusser particularly emphasizes Marx's creation of what he calls an epistemological break, a fundamental shift in how language relates to reality. Marx's linguistic patterns don't simply describe a pre-existing reality but construct a new conceptual framework that makes previously invisible relationships visible. What distinguishes Marx's linguistic techniques, in Althusser's view, is their systematic character. The repetitions, contradictions, and transformations aren't random rhetorical devices, but form a coherent symbolic system that performs analytical work through language itself. Marx employs powerful visual and spatial metaphors to make abstract economic relations concrete and perceptible. One of his most persistent visual metaphors is the veil that obscures economic realities. In Capital, he writes of the mystical veil that covers the commodity, concealing the social relations embedded within it. This veil metaphor creates a visual representation of ideology itself. Marx repeatedly speaks of lifting or tearing away this veil to reveal hidden truths, positioning his analytical method as an act of unveiling or exposure. In the Grundrisse, Marx describes how money conceals the social character of private labour, creating a veil that makes social relations appear as relations between things. This visual metaphor transforms abstract economic theory into a dramatic act of revelation. Vertical imagery pervades Marx's representation of class hierarchies. He consistently describes the bourgeoisie as above and the proletariat as below, creating a spatial visualization of power relations through metaphors of height and depth. In Capital Volume 1, Marx writes of workers being subordinated to capital, creating a visual image of hierarchical arrangement. This vertical imagery appears in his descriptions of higher and lower forms of production, with capitalism positioned as a vertical structure. When describing factory organization, Marx emphasizes vertical chains of command, managers above workers, owners above managers, creating a spatial representation of authority that makes power relations visually concrete. Circulation and movement metaphors dominate Marx's representation of capital itself. He describes capital as flowing, circulating, and moving through different forms, creating a dynamic spatial imagery that captures capital's perpetual motion. The famous circuit of capital, MCM, is presented as a journey through social space, with money transformed into commodities and back again. Marx visualizes this process as movement through different spheres: production, circulation, consumption, creating a spatial mapping of economic processes. In Volume 2 of Capital, Marx develops elaborate diagrams of capital circulation, creating visual representations of economic flows that resemble the circulatory system of a living organism. Capital becomes a substance moving through social space along defined pathways. David Harvey, in The Limits to Capital, provides crucial analysis of Marx's spatial metaphors. Harvey argues that Marx's spatial imagery isn't merely illustrative, but reveals his understanding of capitalism as fundamentally organizing both time and space. According to Harvey, Marx's visualizations of capital flows anticipate contemporary understandings of time-space compression, how capitalism reorganizes geography to overcome barriers to accumulation. Harvey particularly emphasizes Marx's metaphor of the annihilation of space by time in the Grundrisse, where accelerating circulation collapses spatial distances. This spatial metaphor captures how capitalism transforms geography itself through its need for ever faster movement. What makes Marx's spatial metaphors so powerful in Harvey's analysis is their ability to represent dynamic processes rather than static structures. When Marx visualizes capital as flowing rather than sitting, he creates a new spatial understanding of economic systems as perpetually in motion. Marx's symbolic language was not incidental to his revolutionary project, but essential to it. To reimagine society, Marx first had to reimagine language itself, creating a new symbolic vocabulary capable of revealing what conventional economic discourse concealed. His literary devices weren't mere rhetorical flourishes, but analytical tools. The vampire metaphor, the commodity as hieroglyphic, capital as congealed labour, these symbols performed theoretical work by making visible the hidden operations of capitalism that ordinary language obscured. When Marx transformed abstract economic relations into concrete images, factories as prisons, money as pimp, capital as vampire, he bridged the gap between theoretical analysis and lived experience. His symbolic language translated economic abstractions into visceral realities that readers could grasp emotionally as well as intellectually. Edmund Wilson, Into the Finland Station, argued that Marx's literary power was central to his historical influence. Wilson wrote, "Marx's peculiar literary genius allowed him to convey complex economic theories with the force of dramatic literature." It was Marx's symbolic imagination, Wilson suggested, that enabled his ideas to inspire revolutionary movements rather than remaining academic theories. Marx's symbolic frameworks continue to shape modern discourse on capitalism. Contemporary critics still employ his metaphorical structures, speaking of fetishized commodities, alienated labour, the base and superstructure of society. His symbolic language has become part of our conceptual inheritance, influencing how we perceive economic relations even when we're unaware of its source. The creative destruction described by later economists, the liquid modernity of contemporary sociologists, the precarity analysed by today's labour theorists, all echo Marx's original insight that under capitalism, everything solid melts into air. His symbolic framework anticipated the instability and constant transformation of modern economic life. Perhaps most tellingly, the vampire metaphor with which we began continues to resonate in contemporary critiques. From analyses of financial speculation as bleeding productive industries dry, to characterizations of multinational corporations as extracting resources from developing countries, the image of capitalism as vampiric persists. What Marx accomplished through his symbolic language was nothing less than a revolution in perception. By creating a new symbolic vocabulary, he made visible what had been invisible, thinkable what had been unthinkable, and in doing so opened the possibility of transformation. Understanding Marx's literary techniques thus doesn't merely enrich our appreciation of his writing, it enables a deeper comprehension of his economic and political theories. The symbolic and the analytical in Marx are inseparable. His metaphors aren't decorations added to his theory but constituents of the theory itself. As we face contemporary capitalism's continued transformations, Marx's symbolic language offers not just historical insight but practical tools for analysis. His ability to render abstract economic forces in concrete symbolic terms remains a model for how critical thought can make visible what the market obscures, revealing the human relationships hidden within economic forms.